Welcome to this explainer, where we're diving into a massive 2,400-year-old question. Can we be good without God? It's a heavy one, right? Are we naturally wired to do the right thing, or do we absolutely need a divine rulebook to keep us from totally descending into chaos? Today, we're going to unpack some really fascinating arguments from our source material using a structured, inquiry-based approach. So, let's get into it. To bring this huge philosophical concept down to earth, we're going to follow a proxy debate between two characters, Mr and Mrs Schnapper. They're arguing over whether to send their son, Tom, to a religious school. Now, Mrs Schnapper represents a super popular viewpoint. She firmly believes morality is rooted in religious texts. She calls religion a lighthouse in a storm. Basically, it's this immovable external authority. Without it, she argues, we wouldn't have any real way to distinguish right from wrong, and we'd just be going off our own fleeting feelings. Which brings us to part 1, the rudderless dilemma. So we start with this widely held assumption that without God, we're basically set adrift in moral chaos. It's the classic idea, echoed by historical thinkers like Dostoevsky and Sartre, that if there is no God, everything is permitted. Mrs. Schnapper is genuinely terrified of this. She thinks without a divine rulemaker, right and wrong just collapse into our own subjective preferences. But Mr. Schnapper, who is an atheist, totally pushes back. He argues that religion simply isn't required to give their son a firm, objective moral foundation. I want you to just pause here for a second and really chew on this first major hurdle. If we take away that divine lighthouse, do we automatically crash on the rocks of our own personal opinions? Or is there some other anchor out there for right and wrong? Go ahead and discuss it with the people around you, or just mull it over yourself for a moment. All right, let's move on to part 2, Plato's core puzzle. Okay, so this exact dilemma was actually completely dismantled over 2,400 years ago in Plato's famous dialogue, the Euthyphro. Mr. Schnapper uses this ancient logic to poke a pretty massive hole in his wife's argument. He asks her a deceptively simple question about divine command theory. That's the view that things are right or wrong simply because God says so. The question is this: are things wrong because God says they're wrong, or does God say they're wrong because they actually are? It sounds like a word game, but I promise you it's not. Because if you choose that first option, horn 1, and say things are wrong only because God decrees them, you step into a massive logical trap. It makes morality completely arbitrary. Think about it. God could literally command us to kill each other, and suddenly murder would be morally right. But if you jump to horn 2 and say, well, no, God would never command murder because God knows murder is wrong, well, you've just admitted that a standard of right and wrong exists totally independent of God's will. A God who can arbitrarily command, thou shalt kill, makes morality horrifyingly relative. And even deeply important religious thinkers like St. Thomas Aquinas and Leibniz completely rejected the divine command theory for this exact reason. They recognize that making human morality entirely dependent on a divine coin toss is just unacceptably arbitrary. So take a moment to debate this one. Which of these logical paths would you walk down? If you pick the first horn, you kind of have to accept that morality is completely arbitrary. But if you choose the second, you're accepting that morality exists independently of a creator. It's a brilliant puzzle that forces us to really examine our most basic assumptions. Up next is part 3, commands versus obligations. Let's look at Mrs. Schnapper's next events. She argues that moral principles are formatted as commands, right? Which inherently means there must be a divine command issuer. But her husband points out a critical flaw. Just because someone issues a command, like, say, telling you to do the washing up, that doesn't automatically generate a moral obligation for you to obey them. If I just randomly command you to wash my dishes, you have absolutely zero moral duty to do it. So trying to ground moral obligations purely in God's commands falls apart because it requires us to already have a pre-existing moral obligation to obey God. It's totally circular. Let's pause the explainer here for another quick debate. Are power and authority enough to create true moral duty, or is that just a circular argument? Why ought we obey the commands of an authority figure in the first place? What actually gives a command its moral weight? Moving right along to part 4, fear versus empathy. Now we are shifting from abstract logic to human psychology. Mrs. Schnapper suggests that without the fear of God, atheists literally have no real motivation to behave morally. She's kind of channeling Voltaire here, the guy who wanted his servants to believe in God strictly so he wouldn't get robbed. But Mr. Schnapper counters that doing a good deed solely to avoid a lightning bolt or hellfire isn't actually very moral at all. He argues that acting out of genuine empathy and respect for your fellow human beings is infinitely more worthy. Plus, he rightly points out that historical fear of divine punishment definitely didn't stop people from committing brutal acts during, say, the Crusades or the Spanish Inquisition. This is a super fascinating psychological pivot. Discuss this amongst yourselves. Does a threat of punishment diminish the moral worth of a good deed? If a kid only shares their toys because a parent is standing over them with a metaphorical stick, we don't really call that kid generous, do we? So does the same logic apply to adults and divine authority? That brings us to part 5, the sociological reality. Next up, we have to look at this claim by Daniel P. Moloney, who argues that atheist morality is basically parasitic on Judeo-Christian heritage. Essentially, that atheists are just coasting on the ethical fumes of their culture. But history itself gives us a pretty massive counterargument. Look at the ancient Greeks and Romans. Sure, they weren't perfect. They had slavery, much like the religiously devout American South did centuries later, but they were incredibly sophisticated moral civilizations. And here's the kicker. Their religions were totally separate from their morality. Zeus wasn't up on Mount Olympus handing out moral commandments. Yet these societies still had very strong prohibitions against things like murder and theft. Mr. Schnapper uses this brilliantly vivid analogy to drive the point home. He says that while religion often exists alongside civilized morality, it isn't the root cause of it. Think of it like this. Most civilized societies have swimming pools, right? But we don't assume that without swimming pools, society is going to completely collapse. The exact same logic applies to moralizing religions. The historical evidence strongly suggests there's a universal human moral code that exists anyway, and religions just come along later to formalize it and add their own specific refinements. Let's hit pause again to debate this one. Does religion actually create the moral code, or is it just formalizing a universal code that we humans are already inclined to follow? Are we naturally wired to cooperate and not harm each other, or did we really need ancient texts to teach us those basic concepts? And finally, part 6, the picking and choosing paradox. This brings us to a really powerful paradox about how believers actually interact with their own sacred text today. Take a look at some of the rules from Leviticus that the vast majority of modern believers completely ignore or creatively reinterpret. Things like lending money for interest, eating shellfish, or wearing jackets made from a mix of linen and wool. Even the incredibly explicit command, "do not kill," is very often reinterpreted by supporters of the death penalty to mean don't kill the innocent. And this right here exposes the final twist. To know which archaic rules to ignore and which ones to follow, believers must already possess an independent moral compass. People often only accept a religion to the extent that its moral code lines up with their own existing views. They ignore the shellfish rule because it clashes with modern dominant moral perspectives. But in order to be able to pick and choose like that, they literally have to be relying on a prior underlying moral sense. So I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought to debate. If even the most devout folks filter scripture through their own moral lens, where does that lens truly come from? As we've seen throughout this explainer, the assumption that we are morally lost without religion is highly debatable. Whether we're looking at Plato's ancient dilemma, the psychology of genuine empathy, or our amazing ability to selectively read sacred texts, all the evidence suggests our moral compass might just be a natural, inherent part of exactly who we are. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep the debate going.